Oh, that's really good. Yeah.
Oh.
Fred.
Fred. I'm first on.
That is cool. We can talk to him.
Great. Take it away.
Okay. Greetings, everybody. It's great to be here in the beautiful Baltimore branch. It's a branch I greatly admire for all the work that you all do. I mean, since I've been here, we were marching yesterday in Washington against AIPAC. And meanwhile, other comrades were canvassing for housing. We were out flyering last night for the Women's March. I know you're involved in struggles on transit, housing, almost every police brutality, almost every issue there is. And when you look at all these struggles here, the fight for a right to a job for all against Trump's anti-woman racist agenda, jobs not jails, no to the Dakota Access Pipeline, we need jobs now. All these are struggles against imperialism. When you fight the link in Baltimore, you're fighting imperialism. When you fight against the gas and power utility monopoly, you're fighting imperialism. The West Virginia teachers are fighting imperialism. Because imperialism is not just foreign policy. In fact, it's not a policy at all, because a policy is something voluntary that can be changed. It's an economic system. It's the economic system we live under. Or more precisely, it's what Lenin, who led the world's first working class revolution, called the highest stage of the economic system we call capitalism. The class of bankers and billionaires who are the real rulers of this country, who pay the politicians and tell them what to do, is an imperialist class. And every president, senator, congressperson has been their servant since the late 19th century. And so is every general and admiral and the heads of the CIA and the FBI, National Security Agency ad nauseum. I want to quote from Lenin, who, I have it here, who wrote the book on imperialism. It's called, literally and figuratively, it's called Lenin, it's called Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. If it were necessary to give the briefest possible definition of imperialism, we should have to say that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. Such a definition would include what is most important, where on the one hand, finance capital is the bank capital of the very few monopolist banks, merged with the capital associations of the monopolies of industrialists, and on the other hand, the division of the world is a transition from a colonial policy which extended without hindrance to a colonial policy of monopolist possession of the territory of the world, which has been completely divided up. So imperialism is monopoly capitalism, the rule of the banks and the bankers who own or control trillions of dollars of capital, both fixed and liquid. You know, fixed means oil fields, steel mills, and liquid capital is money. And what is capital? Capital is the stolen labor, the surplus value produced by generations of workers on every continent, which Karl Marx, who wrote the book on capital, called dead labor. He called capital dead labor that lives in you, vampire-like, from the blood of the living. And by the way, he wasn't talking like Twilight Saga. He was talking Nosferatu. Because while in theory, the monopoly capitalists, the bankers, the hedge fund managers, their CEOs with their multi-million-dollar salaries, whether old money moguls like the Rockefellers, the Morgans, DuPonts, Mellons, and all that, which Ferdinand Lumberg wrote about 80 years ago in America's 60 Families. Or if you're talking about the nouveau riche, new rich, sounds more profound in French, like the Koch brothers or some of the people behind Trump, speculators and venture capitalists like Carl Icahn, who own and manage, in theory, they own and manage all this wealth. But in reality, they are its slaves because they have to conserve and increase the value of capital. They have to find new and more profitable markets for its investment. They have to produce an ever greater return on their investments. And if they fail to do this, they will be eaten by competitors. if you want to run with a vampire analogy, if you watch vampire movies, usually the vampire has some human, half-dead guy who goes around sort of has to do everything the vampire says. That's the capitalist, and the vampire is capital. And when I say eaten by competitors, that's what's happened again and again in the history of U.S. business. There were once in the early 20th century, there were 300 automakers in this country. After World War II, it was down to 3. It's the big 3, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. And Chrysler is now merged with Daimler-Benz.
Right.
They were called, when I was young, the biggest oil companies were called the Seven Sisters. Now they're down to 4 of the giant oil monopolies that are in the top 10, or hover around the top 10 of the Fortune 500. ExxonMobil, which is a merger of Exxon and Mobil. Chevron Texaco, which is a merger of Chevron and Texaco, and they all have other companies merged into them. British Petroleum, which is half the United States owned anyway, and Royal Dutch Shell. And even a Swiss study showed that 147 companies control 40% of the world's wealth, own 40% of the world's production, actually. But even these companies, these corporations themselves are controlled, or even the creations of big banks. There are 4 banks in this country that have assets worth more than $1 trillion. JP Morgan Chase, which is a merger of the banking houses of Morgan and Rockefeller. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup. There are 6 banks in this country control of assets worth about 40% of the United States gross domestic product. And no, the Rothschilds aren't among them. These are all good, for the most part, good old Anglo-Saxon American capitalists. If you look at the boards of directors of corporations, you'll see the representatives of the same banks. They sit on the boards of corporations, of universities, of hospitals. Their representatives fill the cabinets of every sitting president. They fill Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. But even with all this wealth and power, these vast profits do not satisfy them, or cannot satisfy them, because the problem is that all this profit, no matter how many yachts, the yachts they buy, their mansions around the world, their private airplanes, their servants, their estates on almost every continent, that's just a fraction of that wealth. The rest of it has to be reinvested. If it's not reinvested and doesn't bring in more profits, it loses value, and in the business world, they die as an entity. So their place at the top of the food chain depends on the wealth, on the returns they generate, and it's that drive to increase the value of capital, to find new markets for its investment, is the cause of every war this country has fought since 1898, when the United States invaded the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Before 1860, most of the wars are fought in the interest of slavery, the slave owners who were overthrown in the Civil War. Monopoly capitalism developed after that. Like when they took Mexico, that was for northern Mexico, that was for the slave owners. When they grabbed Florida, Andrew Jackson, that was for the slave owners. But the new capitalist ruling class became a monopoly capitalist class. The invasion of the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico was done openly in the name of white supremacy and manifest destiny. But its proponents, like Albert Beveridge and Chauncey Depew, spoke openly of the need for new markets. After that, the U.S. began invading country after country. I want to quote from Smedley Butler. Maybe other people read this quote. He was a Major General of the Marine Corps and was the most decorated U.S. soldier of the time. He served before World War I, or around the time of World War I. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service. And during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues. Sorry, Haiti and Cuba, a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 and 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. Al Capone was a gangster of the 20s. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 city districts. I operated on 3 continents. You don't find them that honest anymore. But the motives haven't changed. The U.S. invasion of the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico, and that led to a war in the Philippines in which 1 million people were massacred by the U.S. military. We hear about the Spanish-American War. They don't talk about the real war, the Philippine-American War. By the way, the first massacre of Muslims by the U.S. military took place in the Philippines, in Mindanao, and during that war. A decade before that began what was called the scramble for Africa from Europe. In 1880, about 10% of Africa was colonized by European countries. Most of it was independent. It had been ravaged by the slave trade, but it was still independent. Between 1880 and 1910, all of Africa except Ethiopia was seized, torn up, divided by Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and Italy. And the crimes they committed there, from the Belgians in the Congo to the Italians in Libya to the Portuguese, in Angola, the Germans in Namibia, were equal to anything that Adolf Hitler did in the Second World War. There was a Congress held in Berlin in 1884 where the West European powers divided up Africa. It's called the Congo Conference. It was held in Berlin. Around the same time, Japan invaded Korea. There was actually a deal. They made a deal. The U.S. and Japan made a deal that Japan wouldn't object to the U.S. taking the Philippines, if the U.S. would object to Japan taking Korea. So monopoly capitalism, imperialism arose in the major industrial powers around the same time, in the late 19th century, starting around 1870s, 1880s. But despite all this division, where they divided up Africa, they sat down around a table and carved it up. It wasn't enough. And by 1914, they turned on each other in World War I, in a war that was as bloody as 20 million people died in that war, fought mostly in Europe and the Middle East, although a lot of African and Indian colonial conscripts died in that war, along with working class European and U.S. American youth. President Woodrow Wilson called it the war to end all wars, and a war to keep the world safe for democracy. Now, Wilson, he was kind of an intellectual Donald Trump, if you can imagine such a thing. He was a dirty racist.
He was.
Right.
Yes.
Show birth for the nation in the White House.
He did. He was a dirty racist, but he was president of Princeton.
He was president of Princeton, yes. He had a PhD, and he's quite an intelligent racist. But I'm sorry.
But he also took on this populist veneer of being against Wall Street, the same appeal against the global elite. In fact, when the war broke out, he said, this war is being fought because Britain owns the earth and Germany wants it. And we want no part of that. And he said, we have in this country the money power. And when he was running for president, there's this money power, and a few rich men now control the economic life of this country, and that's tyranny. The trouble was that the richest of these men, J.P. Morgan, financed his political career. So, and when he was reelected in 1916, he was reelected on the platform, he kept us out of war. Right. But by that time, J.P. Morgan's First National City Bank had loaned $1 billion, which was a lot of money at that time, to Britain and France to buy arms from the United States. And if Germany won the war, that money would be down the tube. So about a few weeks after his inauguration in 1917, 1 million U.S. troops were on their way to France, were on their way over there to keep the world safe for democracy. A big prize in World War I was the old Ottoman Empire in the Palestine, Iraq, Syria, which was divided up between Britain and France after the war. There was after the economic boom that war unleashed by 1930s. There was the Great Depression. Hitler came to power. Mussolini in Italy, and then came World War II. Fought on 4 continents. 80 million dead. Remembered as the good war by a lot of people because the United States was allied with the Soviet Union and with revolutionary partisans from China to Europe against a truly monstrous enemy, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan. But it ended with the nuclear incineration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States, which had no military necessity, but was meant as a warning to the Soviet Union. While the World War I was a tragedy for most of humanity, especially in the Soviet Union, which bore the largest number of people died, about a third died in the Soviet Union. And of course, 200,000 US GIs died in that war. But for the bankers on Wall Street, many of whom had supported Hitler before the war, it was the best thing that ever happened because that war, the destruction, it gave birth to the US military-industrial complex. But also the destruction of that war made Wall Street the center of the world economy because Europe was ravaged, Japan was ravaged, and everybody was in the United States' debt economically, except in the socialist countries. Within a year, the United States turned on its allies, and the Cold War was launched, the so-called Cold War against communism. Some of us, Sharon and me and Fred, I reckon, grew up during that time when in 1952, there's this thing called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They have a doomsday clock which says how close humanity is to nuclear annihilation. They set it to 2 minutes to midnight. And we had these bomb drills every week in school, even though everybody knew if a nuclear bomb hit, there was nowhere you could go. In fact, if the United States launched a full-scale nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, it would wipe out life on Earth, even if there's not another missile fired. But the Cold War was not cold at all. In Korea, where the United States Air Force dropped 3 million tons of bombs, where 22 cities were leveled. The capital city of Pyongyang had 400,000 people. It was hit by 420,000 500-pound bombs. And so some people are confused why North Korea resents the United States. By the time I was born in 55, 2 years after that war ended, by 1965, the United States was bombing Vietnam, another war in which millions died. And along with these two, and Cambodia and Laos, I think Cambodia is the most bombed country in the world, North Korea being second. These are small countries, just carpet bombed. Fleets of B-52s unloading their entire payloads on villages, And alongside that came, there were covert wars in Angola and the death squads in Central America, the endless supply of arms to Israel to wage its wars in the Middle East against the Palestinian people and its Arab neighbors. Coups, CIA coups in Iran, in Guatemala, in Indonesia. They killed 1 million people, a CIA organized coup. That's what the Cold War, so-called Cold War was. But they won the Cold War. 1991, the Soviet Union was no more. The East Socialist bloc collapsed. The atomic scientists set their clock back to 17 minutes to midnight. And heard there was going to be a peace dividend. All this money spent on war would now be used for hospitals and schools and housing. It wasn't. Within a year, the United States had invaded, or it was bombing Iraq. A few years later, they were bombing Yugoslavia. And then in 2001, with that godsend or somebody sent called 9/11, came the war on terror, which has been raging for the past 17 years, justifying wars against Iraq, Afghanistan, and now we have a new defense strategy by the Trump administration that now says that Russia and China are again the main enemies.
Yep.
And the clock is back at 2 minutes to midnight. So if you want to know why this has been happening for the last 100 and for this country 120 years, basically 120 years, this year since the U.S. invaded the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Forget about globalism or neoliberalism or neocon agendas. We're dealing with capitalists and their political servants, not philosophers. Forget about $5 words like hegemony and whatever. Follow the money. The needs of capital are the reason the U.S. has a $700 billion war budget today. It's the reason they spent trillions on war since World War II, while people in Flint drink poisoned water. And it's why the U.S. has been at war in the so-called Middle East and North Africa for the past 27 years. It's why the bombs are falling on Yemen, why the U.S. won't get out of Syria, why the endless flows of arms and dollars to Israel to dispossess and murder and torture the people of Palestine has gone on for 50, 60, 70 years. It's why Netanyahu, the butcher of Gaza, is in Washington today plotting with the Trump regime to launch war against Iran. It's why Rex Tillerson is trying to orchestrate a U.S. Colombian, Rex Tillerson is Secretary of State, and former CEO of Exxon,
yeah.
is trying to orchestrate a United States, Colombian, Brazilian invasion of Venezuela, which we have Carmen's down there right now, which used to be virtually a colony of the Standard Oil Company, which is the forefather of Exxon. It's why the Trump regime is threatening a nuclear war strike against Korea, which is a threat to the entire East Asian region. Which is just coincidentally becoming the center of the world economy, challenging Wall Street for the center of the world economy. And it's why the danger of nuclear war with Russia is back on the agenda, and the doomsday clock is back at 2 minutes to midnight. Some will say this is irrational and crazy. When they look at all the destruction wrought in the Middle East in the past 3 decades, at the ballooning U.S. national deficit, at the danger of nuclear war, they say, where's the profit in that? Even comrades sometimes say Trump must be crazy when he threatens nuclear war on Korea, when he moves the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. Back when the U.S. invaded Iraq under George Bush, I heard people say it would bring the system down. But in fact, the system would have fallen without it. Because from the point of view of profit, there is one obvious beneficiary, the military-industrial complex, which is born out of the Second World War. But the war industry in this country, the size of it, the sheer size of it, makes the war drive in this country more intense than in the rest of the world, in other capitalist, even other imperialist countries. But it's still, the military-industrial complex is just a manifestation of imperialism. It's not the cause. We have to look at what it was that brought monopoly capital into being in the 19th century. Its roots are in the constant struggle of capital against economic crisis from 1873 to today. And what is the fundamental crisis? Like when the U.S. invaded Iraq, there was a chant, "No blood for oil." Very popular, very catchy, but a bit misleading, because
that's what the war was about.
But it wasn't.
It wasn't?
I mean, it was in a way, but but here's the thing: what is the biggest problem? The biggest problem that capitalists have is not but it's the same thing, really,
right?
Because it's not too little of a scarcity. That's a great investment opportunity. It's too much. The world was swimming in oil. Prices were falling.
Right. If
you look at when the first monopoly was formed in this country, it was Standard Oil of Ohio, formed by John D. Rockefeller, the grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller, who carried out the Attica Massacre, and of David Rockefeller, who just died last year. If you read like a book by Ida Tarbell, a reporter at the time, wrote about how it was formed, it was they basically seized the control of the means of distribution. They made deals with the railroads. They cut out and crushed their competitors by all kinds of means. Okay, so and that's how the Rockefeller Standard Oil drove hundreds of smaller oil companies out of business. When they devastated Iraq and took Iraq's which produces 10% of the world's oil, took that off the world market. What happened?
Prices.
Profits of ExxonMobil, the oil companies, went up to 300%. People were burning, on native reservations right after the Iraq War, people were burning clothes for heat. Heating oil went through the roof. Gas went through the roof. And it opened up huge new markets for capital investment. We are not in Iraq. What's that last line on the end there?
Notre Dame.
No, the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Yeah.
The fracking industry, the whole fracking industry that's tearing up this country, that's destroying native land, was made possible by the high prices caused by the Iraq War.
Right.
And they kept it profitable by the sanctions on Iran, by the bombing of Libya, the war in Syria, which makes it impossible for Iran to build a pipeline
Right.
to the Mediterranean. But then, of course, what happens? The capitalists do what they always do. They produce more than the market can bear, and prices collapse. And so, I don't know if people read the article about Ukraine. And well, anyway, it's they're desperately finding a way. They've basically been at war for the last 27 years to restrict the global oil supply and to stave off crisis. Another example would be like Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was closed to they didn't rush in to invest there, even though Yeltsin was licking the Yeltsin government that came in 1991 was jumping through every hoop the Clinton administration set for it. They were licking the boots of the United States. But the U.S. still expanded NATO into the former Soviet Union. They bought up, Western companies bought up former Soviet companies just to shut them down. Well, here's a quote from Marx. You know, and it came before. People probably know it. Sorry, I need glasses, and I don't. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity: the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into the state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be paralyzed and destroyed. Why? Because there is too much civilization, too much of the means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions. How does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. Marx only lived to see the beginning of imperialism. He died in 1883. The Congress of Berlin that divided up Africa was 1884, though he spoke eloquently against slavery and colonialism. So imperialism is now in a phase, which I've coined this phrase, but accumulation by destruction. The world markets are so saturated that the only way to find new markets for investment is to destroy. And that was always a strong aspect of imperialism, but now it's become the predominant one. Look at Puerto Rico. I don't know if you saw an article that went out in the Workers' World Chat list about how now after the devastation of the hurricane and the lack of help from the United States, Puerto Rico is a blank slate for investors, and they're looking to remake the island, to make profits there. Because basically the value of capital depends upon scarcity. And so it depends on destruction. So would they risk global destruction? Would they risk, a war with Russia, with Korea, Iran, for this profit, just to keep up the value of their capital? In his book Capital, Marx quoted a British trade unionist called T.J. Dunning, and he said this: "Capital eschews, if I'm pronouncing that right, no profit or very small profit, just as nature was formerly said to abhor a vacuum. With adequate profit, capital is very bold. A certain 10% will ensure its employment anywhere. 20% certain will produce eagerness, 50% positive audacity, 100% will make it ready to trample on all human laws, 300% profit, and there is not a crime at which it will scruple, nor a risk it will not run, even to the chance of its owner being hanged. Even to the chance of its owner being hanged. If turbulence and strife will bring a profit, it will freely encourage both. Smuggling and the slave trade have amply proved all that is here stated. Now, at that time, they were talking about the surplus of commodities, but today's added to that is the overaccumulation of capital. I think I'll stop here for the nonce, and maybe we can talk a bit. Okay.
Thank you, Bill.
That was good.
So I can share the discussion. Just a few housekeeping things. If you need to use the bathroom, there's one through this door right around the corner. I'm going to practice progressive stack, so I'm going to prioritize people that have oppressed nationalities, oppressed genders, and people who haven't spoken yet. I'll sort of keep it fluid. Like if there's a question that you'd like to ask Bill, or just like a question that you'd like to pose to the group, however you'd like to do it, I'm just completely open for it. Sure. Comment. Well, Fred, anybody else want to be on stack? For now? Okay, that's fine. Go ahead.
You was telling the truth when you said that the bankers are controlling everything. There was a DVD called Cabinets, a Love Story.
Mm-hmm.
In this scene, there was Ronald Reagan was giving a speech, and this high echelon banker, of America, big time banker, told Ronald Reagan to speed up his speech. That takes a lot of power.
Wow.
For somebody to say that, So that's when they do control.
Yeah. Thank you. I have Thomas on the call on stack. So go ahead, Thomas.
Right. So I'd like to say one thing, which is something that you should have mentioned. The British in India were one of the worst imperialist powers. Because I think before Britain started destroying the industry in India, there was a vibrant industry. But after the British pulled out, the population of India sank to the lowest percent it ever was in world history. And it had basically no industry, and it had to start from scratch.
You're absolutely right. At the turn of, even after hundreds of years of colonialism, at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, India and China were still the centers of the most industrial countries in the world by the industrial standards of that time. I don't mean, it wasn't steam but it was China and India were the world's largest producers. The British crushed the textile industry in India, and in fact, at the Battle of Trafalgar against Napoleon, Captain Horatio Nelson's warship was built in an Indian shipyard. By the late 19th century, industry in India had been destroyed, and in fact, I think Marx even wrote that how many millions of weavers had died on the plains of Bengal to assure the British textile industry 3 years of prosperity out of 10. And in the late 19th century in particular, there were horrible famines. And even in the days of the Mughal Empire that ruled India before the British, which was an oppressive feudal empire, but still they maintained stocks of grain to relieve famine. The British dropped all that, and when famines happened, they just let people starve to death by the millions, and the hope would make them work cheaper. And this is what makes capitalism at one time, at least in Europe, in West Europe, and in colonies, played a revolutionary role as far as in developing modern industry, mass machine production, which is a liberating force for humanity. Of course, it could have happened elsewhere, were it not for European colonialism, but it did. That was the big achievement of the bourgeois revolutions in Europe. What makes imperialism the most reactionary thing ever? That's why we support anyone fighting imperialism. Lenin said, I will support even the Emir of Afghanistan in the struggle against imperialism. We stand with the Islamic Republic of Iran, with Syria, with Iraq, under the government of Saddam Hussein. We stand with, of course, the socialist countries like North Korea and Cuba, or those trying to be socialist like Venezuela. Even Russia, it's a capitalist regime now, but we support them all against imperialism because imperialism seeks nothing else at this point but the complete suppression, destruction of industrial development, the strangulation of industrial development. And really the struggle in the world today is between the right of countries around the world, the right of oppressed countries and formerly colonized countries and poorer countries to develop their industry, their technology, and the drive of the United States, which is now the dominant imperialist in the world, to suppress it.
Cool. Hands are stack. Anybody? Anybody on the phone want to be on stack? Okay. I'll give you a second. Just throw it in the chat also if you want to. Namdi, go ahead.
Okay, you mentioned earlier that since imperialism is the economic system that we live under, and that's the biggest threat to any kind of real and revolutionary change in the world, that should be our main focus. And that we should, I'm just going to use your word, forget the other more specific struggles that we're often talking about. So I was just wondering, where do you think more specific analyses on like race, gender, and like white supremacy, patriarchy, but yeah, where do you think more specific analyses on that fit into dismantling imperialism?
Sorry if I seem to be saying that, because I wasn't saying that at all.
No, I know you weren't. I'm just.
I mean, I think that the struggle against white supremacy, against racist oppression, gender oppression, is the heart of the struggle against imperialism, because those are the main means by which imperialism rules. And I think all these struggles are, we should be in the forefront of every struggle, every struggle against racism, police brutality, as well as economic struggles for equality, for rights. I don't think we should forget any struggle, but I mean, capitalism gave birth to racism. So, there are some oppressions, like gender oppression is as old as class society. It goes back from feudalism and slavery. But racism in particular was born of capitalism, because when the bourgeois revolutions happened in Europe and the bourgeois class overthrew the feudal rulers in the name of liberty, equality, fraternity, they had to have an excuse for why that didn't apply to most of the people in the world. so they came up with racism. Racism was the dominant ideology.
If I could speak to the question as well, I think like imperialism is one of what carries white supremacy and what carries patriarchy through to the rest of the world in a lot of ways, right? Like we were just talking about the war in the Philippines that took place. I mean, it started with Spanish domination in the Philippines, where pre-colonial Philippines before Spain, there was no gender binary in the Philippines, right? There was this whole spectrum of gender expression, and in ways that like we could not understand given gender conditions in the United States today, and that crushed that, right? Like Spain stomped it out because it did not fit in with the economic system that they wanted to put in, and the United States entering in and carrying that further and solidifying that just made it way worse. And if you can think, I mean, the number of, I mean, United States colonialism here in North America completely stomped out completely different ways of thinking about gender. And I don't know, like the way white supremacy manifests in all of that too. Like the Philippines is one of the #1 importers of skin whitening cream in the world, right? Like, and those are just a couple of examples. So it's like there is no stomping out white supremacy and patriarchy and heteronormativity without striking imperialism at the heart. I got Andy next on stack, but if it's a direct response.
No.
Okay. Andy, and then anybody else for stack? I'll put Leah after Andy. Go ahead.
So my question was, I know we spoke about supporting other nations that are menaced by imperialism regardless of their politics, which I agree with. But you hear a lot of people, particularly folks who, I don't know, whoever they are, they say things like, oh, there's Russian imperialism, as in currently, and that there's imperialism of other nations, even oppressed nations. Something that I don't agree with, but how would you respond to people who want to play, well, the US is bad, sure it's imperialist, but what about Russian imperialism? Or people who support Rojava will say Syrian imperialism in Rojava. How do you respond to those sorts of uses of the term imperialism, and what would be a better way maybe to refer to those sort of things?
Actually, no one's supporting Rojava now except for Syria. But
of course, yeah.
Would it be better to answer questions now or take?
I think.
I'm sorry. I didn't know.
No, that's fine.
That's okay.
That's good. No,
Direct response fine.
well, that's a very important question. Back when the Soviet Union existed, and the socialist camp existed, we often heard about Soviet imperialism or Soviet social imperialism. What the great 1917 Bolshevik Revolution showed, and the array of socialist states that then developed after World War II, from East Europe to China, Vietnam, North Korea, Mongolia was actually 1922.
Right.
What they showed was that it's possible to build a society to have industrial development without imperialism, because whatever mistakes or errors the Soviet Union did, they never had any interest in suppressing anyone else's development. They tried to help it. The first steel plant in India was built by the Soviet Union, modern steel plant, furnaces in the old days for the British. The Suez Canal in Egypt was built by the Soviet Union. They always, because there was no conflict between the development of the USSR and the development of other countries. In fact, they aided each other. Even China today, though there are huge inroads of capitalism, China is basically helping development in Africa and countries that have been ravaged by imperialism, and not suppressing it. The Soviet Union is no longer socialist, but I don't think you could call it an imperialist. I don't think you could call Russia an imperialist country. If you look at its gross domestic product and its income, it's like below that of Argentina. It's like it's primarily a resource exporting country that exports oil. It was devastated by what happened in 1991, and it's basically trying to survive. And the only thing that's allowed for Russia to recover economically in the last 10, 15 years has been the alliance with China. That's been the key factor to that. And also they had to renationalize a lot of industry because they had no choice. Just was a matter of economic survival. And the United States wants to destroy Russia because they didn't spend $8 trillion in the Cold War to get a new capitalist rival. They wanted there's no room for a capitalist Russia in the world capitalist economy. In fact, I would say there's been no room for any new imperialist powers since World War I. World War I was when the world was divided. They came up against each other. I think when I say Italy was probably the last imperialist power to emerge. But after that, now it's oppressed with the nations. And Russia is, if I were Russian, I would vote communist in the next elections there. I would vote. But Russia is helping Venezuela withstand the U.S. siege. It's helping Cuba. It's certainly helping Syria. Without without Russia, things would be a lot more difficult for people around the world fighting for liberation right now at this time and place. So ultimately, to survive, Russia will have to return to socialism because this.
I have Leah next on stack. Go ahead, Leah.
I was just gonna say, would you agree that imperialism is always characterized by violence? Like those two are typically always coupled as like imperialist powers are typically always violent to implement power? Or have there been any movements that have been non-violent?
It's always characterized by violence. I mean, they may try to be, ultimately it will have to resort to violence. They try economic penetration and so on, but ultimately they have to turn to violence against the people because it's about destruction. Destruction is the most profitable thing in the world today.
Stephen next on the stack. Anybody after Stephen? Micah.
Bill, could you comment, Karl Marx, I think he coined the term that the capitalists or capitalism will produce its own grave diggers, and in imperialism, I know everything you've been analyzing sounds sort of like gloom and doom, but could you kind of talk about the silver lining, particularly how imperialism in the U.S. has changed the changing character of the working class, particularly the working class being more multinational, being more oppressed people from around the world, that actually, I guess that's sort of I see the antidote to imperialism here. And I just want to make a plug for a book called Market Elections. And Bill was talking about Woodrow Wilson, and also talks about Theodore Roosevelt and all the presidents who have ever been elected in the U.S. and the financial interests who actually pulled the strings. And it kind of goes back to the beginning of U.S. imperialism in this book. So if you want to get a more nitty-gritty of the actual financial ruling class who pulls the strings in elections, but also in the wars that go around through imperialism. This is a great book. It's by Vince Copeland, who is one of our founders of Workers' World Party. So I just want to make a plug for this book.
It is a great book, and anything about Vince Copeland is great. Vince was a steel worker in Buffalo. He was one of the grave diggers. But he was fired for being a communist in the early 50s. 18,000 workers walked out in support of him. He needed to force him back to work after three days. He wrote Expanding Empire also, which is a pamphlet written in 1966, I believe. It was an update of Lenin's Imperialism that goes over a lot of the concepts I was trying to talk about today. I'm glad you brought that up, though, because I don't want to end on gloom and doom. There is a silver lining. There has to be.
Right.
Because along with the monopoly capitalist class came into being the working class. And when it was the industrial working class, when I say industrial, though, I don't just mean in factories and steel plants. Industrial means workers working in cooperation with each other in any industry. Imperialism through the Soviet Union was the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 was the world's first working class revolution, the first time the working class took power. The working class took power in 22 countries. It lost power in 11, but it shows that it's possible. And whilst what was called reindustrialization in the 70s and 80s, the 80s and 90s really in this country wiped out the industrial strongholds of Detroit, of Buffalo, of Milwaukee,
Even
Baltimore, right?
Baltimore.
West Virginia have destroyed the union movement, which is like 30, 35% in the 70s, is now down to like about 7% of the workforce. But it's also created whole new industries that are now industrialized, like retail, these vast stores with thousands of workers, the retail industry, the fast food industry, and these are all huge industries in which millions of workers work in cooperation, in warehouses, and they can't live without the working class, even if its form changes. And the working class is a class that has zero interest in crisis. Its survival depends on a change, and it's very survival, not just standard of living, but very survival has come to depend on the change in the system. And we say the working class, we don't only even mean people working, we mean the unemployed, those whose livelihoods have been stolen. The first proletariat in this country were the enslaved, the people kidnapped from Africa who produced the wealth on which capitalism was built. It's the working class that has the only hope for humanity, but it's working class on a global scale. Like, look at what is in China now. There are more workers than any other country in the world, 200 million workers. And now we see struggles beginning to erupt again here, like the West Virginia teacher strike, where they defied, they wouldn't settle for the contract. These struggles are emerging out of necessity. But what we've got to show the working class here is that our victory has got to be done in cooperation with the working class of the entire world. It's all the political candidates, be it Democratic or Republican, they always talk about America's got to be competitive again. We got to get a lead on the rest of the world. It's America, all of us capitalists and workers against them. No, it's the working class of the world against the capitalist ruling class, which is dominated at this point by the capitalist ruling class of the United States. And the heart of the working class struggle in this country has always been the most oppressed. The Black people, the Mexicano, the Latino, the Puerto Rican workers, the Native people, even on reservations denied employment, they're still part of the working class because they're part of a class that has no way to survive except to sell their labor power to the capitalists. And this class is less than 200 years old, really. Its real growth began in the late 19th century, but it grew up in tandem with monopoly capital, and it is the antidote. And every time we take part in the struggle, be it in going to West Virginia, we have this conference in Detroit on March 23rd by the Moratorium Now Coalition against austerity, against cutbacks. Our comrades there have been fighting against that, and Comrade Jerry Goldberg, who was the leader of one of the leaders of the Moratorium Now coalition in Detroit, spoke today at a rally of teachers in Charleston, West Virginia, or is it Charlestown?
Charleston.
And
Stephen.
We've got every struggle we take part in. We try to build the links, to show the links to other struggles.
Mic on, Steph.
I personally work in the field of public health, which I guess it isn't really as well known that my field has kind of been interlinked with imperialism historically. It's been used to open up markets internationally and domestically in that way, and so also as a field, like, we have a lot of like socialist appearing structures, but we're primarily funded by foundations, the U.S. government, those kinds of things. So, and I kind of struggle with this a lot, like working in my field, because I'm not sure like the ways of which to. I think it could be used for a lot of good, but at the same time, the history of imperialism is so entrenched in a lot of things that we do. It's hard to find ways to kind of work through these systems. So I guess I was wondering if you could speak to those of us who are kind of working within some of these systems, as I'm sure a lot of us are at this table, in ways that we can kind of I guess, work against imperialism in our work in our everyday lives.
Well, all of us who have jobs either work for a present corporation or a present institution. I think the thing about the healthcare industry is it's one of those industries that's now an industry. It's industrialized. It's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers in cooperation. These hospitals, they're health factories. The healthcare workers are workers, and some of the most among them are some of the most exploited workers in this country. You know, the workers in nursing homes. It's where I've spent a lot of time. It's terrible. And I think to organize, when you organize a union, when you organize against exploitation on the job, you are organizing against imperialism. I mean, that doesn't mean the consciousness doesn't have to be brought as well. You know, it's not automatic. You know, there can be, but it's the most important thing is the struggle. Struggle is the way consciousness usually comes afterward, because it's in struggle that people get their world shaken up. They begin to become open to new ideas.
Got Daisy. I want to offer a direct answer also. Daisy, Sharon. No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. If I may grab just straight from the flyer, I kind of wanted to talk about why does the United States pour arms and money to the racist state of Israel? Because I don't know, America as a country is historically very anti-Semitic place and continues to be. We've seen with grave sites being defiled, with comments from Steve Bannon, people like that. We still live in a deeply anti-Semitic country, but why do we pour money into Israel?
And there's no contradiction between being anti-Semitic and being pro-Israel. Israel is the existence of the racist state of Israel on the land of Palestine benefits U.S. capital. It's meant enormous profits for U.S. capital. Why? Alexander Haig, who was Reagan's Secretary of State, said Israel was the largest American aircraft carrier in the world and the only one that can't be sunk. When Israel launched the '67 war, which is 51 years ago, against Egypt and Syria, Jordan, it was that war saved Wall Street and the dollar, because there was a huge movement sweeping the Arab world, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt at the time, to nationalize the oil. And most of the oil is under the rule of these, in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, these kingdoms who were being threatened by the Arab Republican nationalist movement. When Israel economically devastated Egypt and Syria, it changed the political situation in the Arab world in favor of the Gulf monarchies who were servants of the United States. In 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with the King of Saudi Arabia on a U.S. destroyer called the Kirby, and they made a deal by which the King promised to let U.S. oil companies control Saudi Arabia's oil wealth if the U.S. kept the monarchy there in power. The state of Israel was created 3 years later. In 1973, they formally nationalized the oil, but as part of the deal was that the money would keep coming here into Wall Street banks and be spent on U.S. weapon systems. And in fact, the secret of the Cold War and the ability of the United States to maintain unlimited military spending is based on the fact that the Saudis and the other Gulf monarchies and the Shah of Iran at the time agreed to keep the dollar, the oil denominated in dollars, and keep the dollars pouring into the United States. And the enforcer of that relationship with is Israel, because Israel is the enemy of Arab nationalism. And if you look at it today, when they're talking about war against Iran, or a wider war in the region, and they're plotting a rerun of the '67 war. They're right now planning, that's what's going on right now when Trump and Netanyahu are meeting. Trump doesn't actually plan things, but As of the formal meetings and the generals.
He
and
doesn't
whatever get
read
together.
much.
Right. But it's their a war to it's a war. They're planning a war to bail the U.S. oil industry out of its crisis. That's right. And George Papadopoulos, who was Trump's advisor, who was indicted, his whole claim to fame, he was like a young guy. The reason he was hired by the Trump campaign was his work advocating, basically getting U.S. companies, the Noble Oil Company, a contract to drill for gas off the coast of Palestine. And of course, Israel is also the largest recipient of U.S. arms in the world. The Camp David Agreement made Egypt number 2,
Right.
but it's the arms market. But everything Israel does benefits U.S. corporate domination of the so-called Middle East. I say so-called Middle East because it's a term that was thought up by the British military, basically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, obviously, yeah. Thank you.
Is it a direct discussion point?
I want to make a comment on what he just said, and I want to chime in on his answer that he gave to you. Is that you have to understand that Israel is a quote unquote white country, and I say that it's because the Bushes, the late Reagans, the Trumps, the Paul Ryans, and the people, and basically the Republican Party knows that white people will soon be a minority in the world, if not he already is. And so in order to hold on to his hegemony or his power, they must unite together. Because as soon as Trump had come to power, he was already planning really to launch the next war, whether it's going to be against Syria or whether it's going to be against North Korea, because that's what he wants. See, Trump says one thing, but he wants to get at him so badly. And see, Kim Jong-un, or whatever his name is, he's so crazy that he would love to fight America. And just like, to me he does, but that's just my opinion. Right. And also, see, just like he had a spirited discussion with the young Jewish character yesterday in D.C. at the end, and I was telling David as we were going home is that young man blew my mind. Is because he is supposedly a Jew but didn't know his own history. And what I was telling him that I was trying to tell him and David was that, see, in 1945, at the end of World War II, the United Nations created what we now call Israel, so that the displaced Russian Jews would have a place to dwell, because whether you know it or not, there were Jews in Russia who were kicked out, and they had to be placed somewhere. And so before Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, him and the rest of his entourage, they created the UN to give them some place to go. And from then on, trying to go back to what you were saying, is that white people with money and power stick together. It's not a love fest. It's a money thing, and somebody's got to do it. You have to have an oppressed and an oppressor. You see what I mean? And so back to what you were saying, and back to what I was trying to tell David and that young Jewish character, that I mean, they know that white people. Some white people know that they are a minority in the world, and that the world's precious resources like oil and that gold and silver, whatever else comes from beneath the ground, they're in countries where you have people who are darker than I am. And they know that, and in order to get it, they must stick together in order to get it. Just like whatever war is coming up, because that's what's next on the horizon. Too, I was telling Andrew that the American economy is on its way down in the tubes also. And Trump knows it. And see, Trump is so brilliant that he doesn't understand that he does not have an answer. And see, whenever he gets impeached, or whether he leaves office or not, what's going to wind up happening is, okay, he's going to leave office because he thinks he's smarter than God anyway, but America's going to be effed up. But before he leaves office, or whatever he's going to do, see, Netanyahu and Mr. Trump, just like you just said, they must come together with a plan, because we've got to get money and resources from somewhere. And our beloved Jewish people, you have to stay rich and powerful, at least comfortable. So that's why, they're kind of like in cahoots together. That's just my opinion and answer to what you guys have just said. That's all I have to say about that. You feel free to correct me if I'm wrong.
You want to say something to that, Steve, directly?
Well, it's more directly to Daisy's question in regard to anti-Semitism, and it seems like on the surface it's a contradiction of the U.S. supporting the state of Israel, and at the same time, this being such an anti-Semitic country, which we also need to keep in mind in those definitions. Semitic just means people from that region. So actually, saying someone's anti-Semitic or whatever, you can be Arab, or you could be Kurdish, or from people who all lived in that region. Even if you look in the Bible, it was the Philistines and there was always people in that region besides the Hebrews or whatever, or the Israelites. So when the term Semite just means somebody from that region of the earth or whatever, which, the Palestinians, and prior to 1945, which those of Jewish faith, because there was indigenous Jewish people in Palestine, but only made up about 10%, and they lived in harmony. Went in each other's homes, shared food, things of that nature. But like you said, I do agree. Like after World War II, there was a problem with displaced, European Jews. And there was actually a famous, and I don't know the actual ship or whatever, but it was coming directly to the U.S. And the U.S. military stopped that ship from landing, and it was thousands of Jews from Europe who were coming to the U.S. And the U.S. did not want them to come to, and turned them around and made them go to, to the state and use them as cannon fodder to displace Palestinian people or whatever, who can trace their roots, thousands, hundreds and thousands of years, just as, which there's a debate, and it's probably for a different class or whatever, around what makes a nation, what makes certain shared common things, a language, a common border, things of that nature. And there's a lot of debate whether or not is it a religion or is it a nation? Is it a people? And so I just bring this up because there is no contradiction as far as the capitalists, using the state of Israel as cannon fodder against the people of the Middle East or of that region. At the same time, because it's sort of this, go back to the old playbook, use white supremacy, anti-Semitism, racism, and those things. And so now that Trump and sort of the rise of the right, you see more desecration of synagogues and things of that nature or whatever, because they want to divide people or whatever, and they will use whatever form they can if it means, bringing up sort of these old backward kind of cliches where like Jews run the world, they run Hollywood, they run the media, and things of that nature, which if you really, really want to look behind or whatever, it's mainly just straight Anglo-Saxon white men that actually rule. Not to say there isn't rich Jewish people who have power and influence or whatever. And after World War II, the majority of most, it wasn't just because they were Jewish, a large percentage of Jews in Europe were communists and revolutionaries and had socialist leanings and were workers or whatever. And they are the ones that faced the brunt of extermination and genocide. And those that had money and power and wealth or whatever were the ones that could actually buy and escape or whatever. Not saying some bourgeois or more wealthy Jewish people didn't die, but the vast majority were the revolutionary working class Jewish folks in Eastern Europe who felt the brunt or whatever, which left a vacuum of a rich historical history. I think even Karl Marx had some Jewish history, or a lot of it. He was Jewish. He was Jewish. I think Trotsky might have had, or some other. There was a lot of different revolutionary figures who, whether or not you believe in the nation or not, or whatever, but they were identified as being Jewish or whatever. And it's kind of a tragedy or whatever that after World War II, those revolutionary, current or whatever was exterminated. And anyway, I've spoken too much anyway.
So I've still got Sharon on stack, but this has been a rich discussion. I want to see if anybody, Bentley, if you want to respond directly afterwards.
Oh, afterwards.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just sort of wanted to speak to what I think you said, Bill, about Zionist support for Israel and anti-Semitism not being contradictory at all. Because like Israel is like very bad for Jews. Like in Israel right now, like Mizrahi Jews and Ethiopian Jews are being imprisoned and are being like persecuted and oppressed constantly. And like we're here, like where Israel's like a home for a very specific type of Jew, and it's just not good for Jews. So I just sort of wanted to bring that up.
Is there any additional question before Bill responds? Okay.
I do.
Okay.
And I'm glad you said that. I once met Charlie Baton, who was the founder of the Black Panther movement in Israel, which is a movement of Jews from the Arab and African world. He said for generations, my family lived in Morocco in peace and harmony. Then I came to Israel and became second-class citizens. The vast majority of Semitic, by the way, is a language group. It just means if you speak Hebrew, Arabic, Amharic, the language of Ethiopia, one of the languages of Ethiopia, or several languages no longer around, like the Canaanite language. I think Aramaic is still spoken in a village in Syria that was destroyed by some of Washington's conference. But the vast majority, the majority of capitalists in the U.S. capitalist ruling class are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
Right.
However, if you go to West Virginia, you find some of the poorest people in this country are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants too.
Right.
There are wealthy Jewish bankers, more than there used to be, but there are plenty of poor and working class Jews. I mean, every nationality and is divided into classes. The utility of Israel for the United States stems from the importance of that region as the source of the world's most profitable commodity, oil, and the need to control it. And Israel fulfills that function with great value, and that's why you have. I mean, Trump's an anti-Semite. He's also the most pro-Israeli president there's ever been. So they don't see any problem there. And by the way, any capitalist, no matter what their stated religion, whether they were baptized or had a bar mitzvah or whatever, their God is money.
That's right. Money.
That's what the capitalists worship. And they do what they do not because of their religion or nationality. They do what they do because it's profitable.
Sharon?
Stop eating a banana. Oh. I'm sorry, I was swallowing some food. No, I just, and you hate to look at yourself in that thing, but I wanted to make two comments of the slightly changing the subject. The only thing I'll say a little bit on that last subject is words change their meaning all the time. There's like the root meanings of these words, and it's all sorts of things. I mean, in a popular sense, when people say anti-Semitism, they mean anti-Jewish, anti-bigotry against Jewish people as a religion.
That's why.
And I think that's how a lot of people in the popular sense in this country view that terminology. Even though I think that the comrades historically that contributed to that conversation is very important. I wanted to say something about Workers' World Party's history on the issue of imperialism, but we probably also have to broaden the discussion, and there's not enough time to do it exactly, but there's another part of Lenin's thesis is on imperialism, and that is support for the oppressed countries fighting against imperialism and their right to self-determination. And the party sort of has a long, rich history of this. Some of it I can't even remember, but I always remember the first wave of things before I came into the party there was a protest around independence for the Congo, which one of our founding members, Sam Marcy, was walking the picket line. I always remember this famous picture when very few people in this country even knew about the struggle that Patrice Lumumba was leading. And of course, he was assassinated by the CIA. But the average person didn't know about it. And we held one of the first demonstrations. The other thing is, even before people knew about Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh sent a thank you letter to Workers' World Party for that demonstration. It was a small demonstration. It was before my time, too. But during my political period, what I most remember of some of the key important things, and there's a lot of them, it's a lot more than what I want to mention, but it's kind of important, is a couple of things. The question of Palestine. It's much more, it's popular now, not popular, but I mean, people kind of know it, it's recognized now. You couldn't even have a demonstration for the Palestinian people without, and of course it's still a little true, but you would be risked being attacked by fascists. I mean, some of our comrades were sent to the hospital during this time. So I know Bill remembers it. One of our comrades almost lost their eyesight as a result of some of the battles, but it wasn't popular in the anti-war movement. Even in some of the other left organizations, to raise Palestine was a very, very militant question. The other thing was around Iraq, and I kind of was impressed with Bill, the point that Bill made at the very beginning of his talk around, imperialism's not policy. It's not about hegemony. It's not about, government, this and that. And if you don't understand that you can fall into a trap that I remember we were really successful in not doing. There was part of the whole peace movement, quote unquote peace movement, not anti-imperialist movement, that was demanding sanctions, not bombs, in the first Iraq war. In other words, they didn't want the U.S. to bomb Iraq. They wanted to inflict sanctions on it because it wasn't a violent thing, even though it was very much an imperialist maneuver that killed more Iraqi children than the actual bombs in Iraq. And we did a lot of work around that issue, not only demonstrations where we brought the oppressed community into the demonstrations, and we got criticized for it, and also refused to attack Saddam Hussein, which was a big thing at the time. So I just want to raise a couple of those things that other members here could talk about all sorts of issues, from Yugoslavia, the division of Yugoslavia, to a multitude of different issues that the party took on when it wasn't popular. And then later, of course, it became popular. Of course, Syria is a big issue now. And maybe some other time we'll have some people talk more specifically about Syria. Because you could take each of these countries, you could take the whole continent of Africa and talk about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. There's a famous book about it. So I just wanted to add that because I thought it's important. Part of these classes are open to everybody, but there are also classes for new members and candidates. And so I felt like it was important to say something about the party's specific history around the struggle imperialism. But I wanted to end my last remark real quickly on what Nandi raised, because I thought it was an important question. And I think I'm going to repeat some of what was said at the beginning of the discussion, because I think every struggle that we engage in is important. Anything that gets other working class and oppressed people into the fight against capitalism on any level, even if it's about getting better bus service, or if it's about getting a street light fixed, or it's against police terror, or it's even on the job struggle, is important, because Bill's right, it raises consciousness, but also any blow against the system, even if it's a tiny eking away, affects people around the world. We're in a global system. If we weaken the bosses in West Virginia, the teachers do, then it helps the people in Philippines who are struggling against imperialism. So I think it's like each struggle is linked together. There's no way in a global world where capitalism and imperialism are global systems that it doesn't do that. I think the easy way for me sometimes to remember it, and why we say capitalism sometimes and imperialism interchangeably, it's just like the word anti-Semitic. It's like people understand pretty much at this point that capitalism is a system that puts profit before people. It's much more complicated than that, but people understand that, and it's time we go out and try to educate on capitalism. But Lenin taught that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. So they're both, you could say a little interchangeably. Imperialism is a much more scientific term for it. And sometimes in people's minds, we kind of think of it's the part of the capitalist. It's the part that is responsible for plundering the world on a global basis. I guess you might put it that way. But that's all I wanted to say. I just think that there's a big history. We had a lot of old pictures of every practically international struggle where the party's taken a position, and also all the smaller struggles that people are talking about are so critical, because we can sit in a room and talk about imperialism. We need to do it because we have to have a bigger picture about what we have to destroy if we're going to actually change things, so we're not back to just reforming the system and having the same old problem, which is what unfortunately has happened for decades. You reform something and then it's all thrown out the window because we still live under the same system. But you do have to still raise consciousness. So fighting those smaller things, I think, is critical. And it's not that they're smaller either, because man, if your son, daughter, or loved one is facing police terror, that's a very, very major issue. In fact, they're part of the imperialist system because it's the state. Anyhow, I don't want to go on that long, but
Sure. You want to wrap it up? Any other discussion points?
Why is everyone shoe laced?
Because of
oh shit.
because of Moreno, Sharon's dog.
Hey, the other
Got a
shit.
hold of my shoelaces.
Oh gosh.
It's a good question.
I have shoelaces down in if you need.
When Lenin, Karl Marx popularized the slogan, "Workers of the world unite." Workers of all nations unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And Lenin, when the Communist International was founded after the Bolshevik Revolution, he changed that slogan to "Workers and oppressed people of the world unite." Now today, the majority of oppressed people in the world are also in the working class. At that time, there was many countries where the vast majority of people were small farmers, peasants, fisher people. But he emphasized imperialism as the name for monopoly capitalism because it pointed out that the power of the capitalist ruling class rests on the domination of the whole world. The bulk of the profits that come into the bank vaults of the ruling classes of the imperialist countries, which at that time were the United States, West Europe, and Japan, come from the plunder of Africa and Asia, Latin America, Pacific region. And we talk about oppressed nations. We talk about oppressed nations in this country too.
Right.
That means the Black nation, the Mexicano Chicano nation, in the Southwest, the Native nations, Puerto Rico, the rise of the people migrating here from many nations who have been driven from their homes because their economies have been destroyed by imperialism. And we all have a common interest, and it's really in the interest of white workers to stand with the oppressed and follow the leadership of the oppressed, because that's the only course for saving the working class, for the liberation of the working class from the endless cycle of capitalist crisis, which is getting worse, as we all know. I wanted to say a word, and in our record, like Sharon said, we had the first demonstration on the Congo, the first demonstration against the war in Vietnam, the first demonstration on Palestine. Every demonstration for Palestine back then, we were attacked physically by groups like the JDL with lead pipes. And once our office was held at gunpoint, and we never backed. We always held the ground. That was our principle. And we've also, we stood with the Black Panther Party. We stood with the Young Lords Party. We raised money for Rob Williams and Mabel Williams when they organized the Armed Black Guard in Monroe, North Carolina in 1961, money to buy guns. And we defended Mae Mallory, who was one of Rob Williams' colleagues when she went to Ohio, and we defended her against extradition to North Carolina. Rob Williams and Mabel escaped to Cuba.
He might
I thought I could.
I just want to say a word about the struggle with the Trump regime and Russia, since it's on the flyer, because it's not about Russia. It's a fight inside the U.S. ruling class. Liberals or right-wingers, they both serve capital. Capital needs war with Russia. We stand with the oppressed nations around the world because it's not a question of, what kind of, if Saddam Hussein a good guy or a bad guy. That's not the issue. Is Bashar al-Assad a good guy or a bad guy? The issue is because the wars against these countries come from the needs of imperialism itself. They're not out to destroy Bashar al-Assad. They're out to destroy Syria. The news, when the U.S. was bombing Iraq, I heard on the news, U.S. bombers pounded Saddam Hussein today, like they were hitting him personally. No, they were out there to destroy Iraq. They wanted to destroy Russia, not Vladimir Putin. But the Trump campaign, which was presented in the media, both liberal and conservative, as being some kind of populist upsurge of the working class, others say white working class, BS. No, it was a revolt by second-tier capitalists, hedge fund speculators,
Right.
Real estate parasites, fracking billionaires who were locked out by when they talk about the elite, they were locked out by the old money bankers at the top, and they wanted in. And a lot of them had gotten very rich from the Iraq War, from the fracking profits, the fracking industry. Guys like Harold Hamm and Kelsey Warren, who were behind the DAPL pipeline, they were big backers of Trump. And there was kind of a contradiction. The U.S. ruling class broke out over the price of oil because the Obama administration and Kerry, along with Saudi Arabia, devised a strategy to instead of trying to drive up the price, to drive it down, to try to hurt Russia, to devastate Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and other oppressed countries. And the big oil companies like ExxonMobil were okay with that because they had reserves. ExxonMobil controls a quarter of the output of Saudi Arabia. But by the late 2016, even ExxonMobil was getting hurt, and the value of its reserves got downgraded. So clearly the Trump campaign made an alliance with ExxonMobil. That's why Rex Tillerson got the job as Secretary of State. You can see why John McCain is hostile to Trump, even though he's equally right-wing. His campaign, his whole political career was financed by Chevron Texaco. So they don't like ExxonMobil getting a lock on the State Department. I mean, these guys all hate each other. There's actually not love between them. They're gangsters. It's like the Commission of the Mafia. They're all always trying to. You remember that scene in The Godfather where he's one of the gangsters, one of the leaders of the other families is saying to Don Corleone, if Don Corleone controls all the cops and the judges, he must share them with us. Of course, he must pay for we're willing to pay for these services. We are not communists. But of course, it ends in a gang war because that's how it ends up. It ends up that way between capitalists as well. This is a gang war going on in Washington between the radical, the right, the slightly poorer billionaires against the, who are now in alliance with one faction of big capital against other factions of capital. And they're all enemies of the working class. They're all enemies of the oppressed. They're all servants of the Pentagon war machine. And the only answer for us is to build a movement that can overthrow them, which is what we've been trying to do. Our party's been trying to do since 1959 as part of the world working class upsurge that began with the Bolshevik Revolution. But things have changed a lot, and it's time that things are getting more propitious to finish it, because the crisis is deepening, and crisis is the social change is generated by crisis. We don't like crisis. Crisis causes tragedy and suffering for a lot of people, but it's when and where change comes from. And we have to take advantage of every contradiction, of every struggle that breaks out to try to build that kind of movement, because it's the only answer for the working class. It's the only answer for humanity.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Baltimore.
So I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can do some announcements. Thanks to everybody that's on the phone. You can stay on for the announcements.